For most of my life, I was quite skeptical about any notion of God, whether within us or outside of us. A romantic part of me would have liked to find something in this domain that it could endorse, but I had been born and raised a skeptical, unromantic intellectual. My father used to make merciless fun of the Unitarian minister, Reverend Dan Lyon, who lived across the street from us. If anybody knows him, I'd love to hear it. I haven't met him. I haven't seen him for a long time. He died not long ago. Dan Lyon declined to defend the conventional idea of God, but he had his own unconventional ideas. My father considered this ridiculous. Either you believed or you didn't, was his idea. So Dan, in my father's view, was just trading on confusion. In recent years, as the title of my sermon, The God Within Us, is meant to suggest, I've come to the conclusion that my father was wrong and Dan was right on this question, but it took me a long time to get here. In keeping with my father's opinions, my family belonged to no religious community. I did attend a prep school where I was required to attend church every Sunday, but for decades thereafter, I did not darken the door of any religious institution. My mind began to open a bit after 20 years, when two things happened to me. I went through my first divorce, and my family finally confronted my father's alcoholism. Unable to cope with these developments on my own, I found my way into therapy and into 12-step groups. In the 12-step groups, to my great surprise, I encountered a remarkable amount of essentially unconditional love. I thrived on this love, both receiving it and giving it. I also encountered the well-known 12-step talk about a higher power. Impressed as I was by the love that I was finding in the groups, I thought I should try to have an open mind about the higher power as well. One day I asked a young woman whom I had heard talking in meetings about her relation to God if she would share some of that experience with me. But when she began thumbing through her Bible for verses that might aid in my conversion, I ran for the hills. I had a lot of respect, and I still do, for the Hebrew prophets and for Jesus, but I was not ready to let one book decide how I should think about this very important question. So my thinking about God went into a holding pattern. At the same time, I was beginning to read the poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi, of which we heard a sample. I was fascinated and attracted by what people call Rumi's God intoxication. But my mind stubbornly insisted that I couldn't let myself be intoxicated by something that I had no good reason to believe existed. Thus the holding pattern continued, until, sure enough, I was presented with a second major learning opportunity in the form of a second divorce. Seizing this opportunity, I investigated myself and my relation to the world in even greater depth than before. By this time, I was regularly teaching Plato. I gravitated toward Plato because of all the major Western philosophers. Plato is the one who writes in the most detail about love. As a result of my 12-step experience, love was a subject that interested me a great deal. My history of divorces might also suggest that love was a subject about which I had a couple of things yet to learn. Forever, right? Like the 12-step programs and the Bible, Plato also draws a close connection between love and God. But why speak of God as well as of love? For many people, the name of God the word God carries highly negative connotations. It reminds them of religious authorities and politicians who do horrible things in the name of what they call God, things that are hardly compatible in many cases with love. What's to be gained by continuing to use a word that has been so misused? Wouldn't it be better simply to speak of love and leave it at that? Plato and other philosophers have some useful things to say about this question, but what really enabled me to understand their answers was further experience of love itself. In the fall of 2002, for the first time in my life, I actually fell in love. I had been infatuated a couple of times, so I knew what it's like to have champagne bubbles in my veins. But I had never had a relationship that deepened continually over the course of months and years. Besides giving me the most intense emotional experience I had ever had, this gave me the opportunity to experience a surprising fact about love, to which Plato draws our attention. This is that besides sheer emotion, love has what one can only call an intellectual dimension. In his Symposium, Plato has Socrates relate teachings that he received from a priestess named Diotima. Diotima said that we don't just love and want to have what seems to be our other half. We love and want to have what we think is good. So being in love is a chance to learn more about exactly what it is that one thinks is good. And this is just what my experience of becoming more and more in love was like. It was an experience of increasingly appreciating my beloved's virtues, thus getting a clearer idea of what it exactly was that I thought was admirable and good. This clearer idea then fed back into my emotions, making me even more exalted at being in a relationship with someone who had the qualities that I valued so much. And here's the paradox. This powerful experience of love also made me more aware of my own freedom. For it made it clear that what I was looking for in a life partner wasn't merely sex or security or what we might call emotional support. Beyond those, I was looking for a human being who could help me to clarify and pursue what is really good in life, rather than just pursuing whatever I had come to be wired to pursue. I was looking for someone who could help me to rise above my past experiences and achieve greater inner freedom. This issue of inner freedom was not a minor one for me because my father's alcoholism and other problems had left scars on me that made inner freedom, or being really in charge of my own life, something that I can't take for granted. I have to work for them every day. If you've had an addict in your family, you probably know what I'm talking about. Addicted people live in a kind of confusion in which they regularly fail to pursue something that their thinking self acknowledges is truly good. Thus, they fail to be free, fail to be fully in charge of their own lives. People who have adapted to living with addicts often themselves have a parallel difficulty in being fully free. My life exhibited this sort of difficulty for many years. I got major help in my search for inner freedom from 12-step groups, and I've gotten even greater help from daily sharing with my wife, Kathy. So I know on a deep level how love and inner freedom can nourish each other. But if love contributes to our inner freedom in this way, then love is not just a biological urge or a feeling. It is also an elevating process that helps us to be more in charge of our lives by pursuing what we think is truly good and not just whatever we may have been wired for. I don't think you'll be surprised when I call an increase in this kind of freedom an elevating process, an experience that takes us higher. It takes us higher by taking us closer to something that we feel we are somehow called to be. We are called to be free, to be in charge of our lives. And when we don't do this, we feel that we've failed. But when we see this dimension in our lives of going higher toward greater freedom, we see what I think is, in fact, the kernel of truth in the idea of God. Not obviously of God as a separate being from us, in relation to which we remain lowly and subservient, but rather of God as an ideal that we can approach within ourselves. As Emerson said, the sublime is excited in us by the great Stoical doctrine, obey thyself. So here, within our own experience, is where the idea of something higher originates. Since the potential for rising toward this higher thing, the ideal, since this potential is within us, we can say, as Emerson and Rumi do, that this God is within us, that we don't need to go outside in order to find this God. The people who think of God as outside us usually don't notice that if God were outside us, this God wouldn't have the kind of authority that an ideal possesses. We may think of a God that's outside us as having great power, but it can't speak to our inner self, to the sublime in us, in the way that the God within us does, the God that's our own ideal. So if we think of God as having genuine authority and not just power, we need to think of God not as outside us, separate from us, but rather as within us. In addition to our not being separate from God, another consequence of God's having genuine authority and being within us is that we can't be separate from other people. When the 12-step groups taught me how my freedom can be nourished by receiving and giving love, they taught me also that I can't make exceptions. I need to love especially the people who drive me crazy, such as my alcoholic father, numerous politicians, and other powerful and irresponsible people. As Jesus said, I need to love my enemies, because as long as I hate them, as long as I draw boundaries between me and them and insist that I'm different from them, I wind up being dominated by my relationship to them, driven crazy by it, and thus I'm certainly not free. How in the world can I love irresponsible people who drive me crazy? By reminding myself that the capacity for freedom, which I'm calling the God within us, is in them too. Not necessarily actual freedom. For example, my father's level of freedom when he was drinking was very limited. But the capacity for freedom is still there. My father had the same mixture of freedom and unfreedom that I have when I'm being driven crazy by him. How can I feel that I share the capacity for freedom with him? By wishing him well, even while he's driving me crazy. The Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book prescribes an exercise for this purpose. It's often called, and this is an exercise for alcoholics to carry out in regard to the people they resent, and for any of us to carry out in relation to regard to the people that we're upset about. The exercise is often called the resentment prayer. You pray for, you wish for the person you're upset with to receive the same good things that you want for yourself. Wishing them these things reminds you that they are human as you are. You do this because you know that it's only by reminding yourself of their humanity that you yourself can be free. I do this resentment prayer a couple of times a day, wishing good things to all the people I can think of with whom I have some kind of beef. It gets to be a pretty long list. To help myself to be free. And I find that this effort does in fact increase my freedom dramatically. It creates sometimes a minimal but a real love in me for all of these people. And this changes my feeling about the world as a whole in a deep way. It shows me what Emerson was talking about when he said that the blessedness of the soul of the whole is all accessible to us, is self-sufficing and perfect in every hour. Now you may be thinking, this is all very well, but why should I give the name of God to the increasing freedom and love or the blessedness that Wallace is describing? My first answer is that you don't need to use the word God ever. The word in itself doesn't matter at all. What does matter is the freedom, the love, the blessedness, and the authority that they possess. That they are higher because they make us fully free, fully in charge of our lives. That this freedom, love, blessedness, and this specific kind of authority that they have are real is the main idea that I hope you'll take home today and think about. But I do have an additional suggestion, which can be useful, especially for purposes of appreciating the humanity of the people who do use the word God for the highest thing that they believe in. For this purpose, it's useful to ask, what makes this highest thing highest for them? I suggest that in most cases, what makes their highest thing highest is probably not that it's a separate being, a being that's outside us, or that it has great power. Rather, what makes it highest is that it embodies something very similar to the freedom and love and the authority of those and the blessedness of those that I've been describing. The part about its being a separate being gets added on because people have a hard time imagining how else the freedom and love and so forth could be fully real. The mystical poets, on the other hand, including Emerson and Rumi, revel in the apparent paradox that the God of freedom and love is higher than a great part of what we think and do, but is nevertheless within us. Rumi writes, "Lo, I am with you always," means when you look for God, God is in the look of your eyes, in the thought of looking, nearer to you than yourself. There's no need to go outside. Be melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. A white flower grows in the quietness. Let your tongue become that flower. When we look for God, as Rumi says, we're looking for what's highest, what most deserves our love. By looking for what most deserves our love, we're already elevating ourselves above the fear, the anger, and the self-centeredness that keep us from being free and from loving. So whatever it is that most deserves our love is already at work in our looking for it. It has always been at work in us, in one form or another, though much of the time we don't realize it. In order to realize it, we have to wash ourselves of our everyday egoism and indifference, of our fears, our painful experiences, our social indoctrination. Beneath all of these things, in our inner quietness, the white flower grows, the loving freedom that the mystical poets call God.